Edward H. Stokes. I'm going to give you an overview about early photography first, and then I'll talk about a little bit about Stokes. There's probably a lot more to know about him than I do, so there are opportunities for more research, which perhaps the Trent House will undertake, but at least this will give you some idea about who he was. And so first, let's talk a little bit about the daguerreotype, because he was a maker of daguerreotypes in Trenton. The daguerreotype process was introduced by Louis-Jacques Mondet Daguerre in 1839 to the public in Paris. This is a picture of him 10 years later. The French government gave him a pension in exchange for him making public the secret of how to make daguerreotypes. Can you hear me okay there in the back? Yeah? Okay.
So.
So it became free to use for anybody, except in England, where he patented it before he got the pension. In New Jersey, the first daguerreotypes were made by Seth Boyden in Newark. Seth Boyden was an inventor. He was an engineer. He had many wonderful innovations, including the patent leather process. He made improvements to locomotives. He had a mechanic shop right across from where the Newark Public Library and the Newark Museum is now, in that park. And one of the things that he tried when he read about the daguerreotype was, let me see if I could make one of these. So he built himself a camera, which is now at the Newark Museum. Doesn't look much like a modern camera or even like a typical daguerreotype camera. The light comes in the bottom when you open the two doors there at the bottom, and it's reflected by a mirror up to the top where the daguerreotype plate is. And one of the advantages of this system was that it reversed the image left to right, because normally a daguerreotype with a regular camera comes out reversed. It's a mirror image. So if you take a picture of a building with a sign, it'll come out backwards, just as if you were looking at it in a mirror, unless you point the camera into a mirror. And in his case, he built a camera that had a mirror built in. So he made some daguerreotypes with it. Unfortunately, none of them were known to exist, but they were mentioned in the local paper. And they put up a statue to Boyden in the park there. And it says that he made the first daguerreotypes in the United States, which is not true, but he probably made the first in New Jersey in the late in 1839, just a couple months after Daguerre announced the process. So what is exactly a daguerreotype? I'm going to just go over here a moment and pull one out. So you'll typically see daguerreotypes in cases. Sometimes they're put into frames, but they're always protected by glass because the surface is extremely fragile, and they will tarnish when exposed to air, just like silverware will tarnish. It's a copper plate, and then it's coated with silver, and then it's buffed until it becomes very, very shiny. And that's why they call it a mirror with a memory, because if you look at it from a certain angle, you see yourself in it, you don't see the picture. Another angle, you look at it, it looks like a negative. So it's a very strange object. But it's once you get that silver plate prepared, you then put it in a fuming box and expose it to vapors of iodine. The iodine combines with the silver to form light-sensitive silver iodide. It's then ready to be put into the camera. So you put it in a dark slide, then you put it in the camera, and then you can take a picture. You take the picture, then you take the slide out with the plate, and you put it into another fuming box, this time with fumes of mercury. Each of these fuming things has a little light, a little candle under it, so that it makes fumes. Not exactly the stuff you want to breathe. So once you do that, then the picture, which was invisible before, it suddenly appears. It's what's called a latent image when it's exposed, and then it's made visible through development. And then you put it in a fixing solution, another nasty chemical, and then you wash it, and typically this was not the original process, but an improvement on it. You would then tone it in a gold solution, which helps make the image more permanent and gives it more contrast. And then you put it in one of these cases and separate the glass with a brass mat so that the daguerreotype is not touching the glass. And it's sealed around the edges with paper so that the air can't get in. So that's how they were made. And this was the dominant way of making photos in the 1840s and 50s. The vast majority of the daguerreotypes were portraits. People really wanted to have their portraits made. Before photography, they had to go to an artist to have it themselves painted or sketched, and that was very time consuming. It was also not as accurate as a daguerreotype. The price of daguerreotype started out as relatively expensive, a few dollars, which was multiplied by 20 or so to get today's value. But by the 1850s, as we'll see, the price came down considerably. There also were daguerreotypes made of landscapes and architecture, and very rarely events like fires where a photographer just happened to be there and there was a big fire and they took a picture of it. And there were some scientific applications as well. The process was superseded beginning in 1850 with the introduction of glass plate negatives from which multiple prints could be made. With a daguerreotype, if you wanted another copy, you had to take a picture of the daguerreotype, which would then be reversed left to right. So it was expensive. It was on copper, an expensive material. With glass, you could have an inexpensive negative and then multiple prints on paper, as many as you wanted to. So by 1860, the daguerreotype really was going out of favor, and then they become the era of paper prints. But they still continued to be made in the 50s, and that's what Stokes was after. So the plates were made in standard sizes. You can see them on the screen here: 6 plate, quarter plate, half plate. And the ones on the table, I guess, are quarter plates. And they had certain disadvantages, as I mentioned, the reflection. It took a long time for the person to sit there to have their picture recorded initially. We were talking about minutes. I'll show you a slide a little later where a photographer talks about how long it took. But then they introduced additional fuming steps, so that in addition to the iodine, they would fume it with chlorine vapors and bromine vapors, also noxious gases. But that really made the plates much more sensitive, and then they could reduce the exposure time down to a few seconds. But the advantages were the extreme detail of the daguerreotype. You could take a magnifying glass and you just see more and more and more. Some of Daguerre's original daguerreotypes, where he took street scenes in Paris, people looked at them with magnifiers and they could count the bricks down the street of the building. You know, it really wasn't superseded in accuracy until the space age, with some of the incredible cameras that were developed for satellite photography. Are they looking now? They could be watching us. And another advantage was that they, although they tarnish, they don't fade. So you don't want to expose them to excessive amount of light, but kept in their cases, they don't fade. And the surface is very, very fragile, but when it's sealed, that's not a problem. And of course, they were much more affordable than paintings, but expensive compared to later paper photographs. So when does the daguerreotype begin in Trenton? Actually, the earliest known daguerreotypist in New Jersey advertised in Trenton, J. Van Duzen, on the corner of Warren and State Streets, not too far from here, in February of 1841. And then Livermore and Stinson were at the Rising Sun Tavern in May of 1842. Now these were itinerant daguerreotypists who would go from town to town. They would come, they would advertise, they'd say they'd be in town for a week or two, and then they'd move on and go somewhere else. And that's how the daguerreotypes really begin, is with these traveling photographers. There was a Collins and brother at Old City Hall around 1845. And then John Mason, who was based in Providence, Rhode Island, visited Trenton in 1848 and did a daguerreotype, which I'll show you a copy of in a moment. This is J. Van Dusen, who I mentioned earlier. He also went to Cooperstown, and he had this printed form that he could use in different places. And it says daguerreotype miniatures, and then he says the time of sitting required was from 5 to 25 minutes with the aid of the sun. But now, his present method, he can take pictures from 5 seconds to 2 minutes without exposed to the sun. Before, people had to sit in bright sunlight in order to have their picture made. So he doesn't mention it, but it's with these additional steps that enable portraiture to become much more feasible, and the quality was greatly enhanced. So this is the same guy who was in Trenton, and this actually the same year that he was in Cooperstown. And then he has like a blank where he could fill in where he is. In this case, he's at Mr. Belknap's, Cooperstown. Here's the copy of the picture by Mason. It's the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum. And this was an engraving from a daguerreotype, and then they could then print from the engraving. The original is unknown. This is from December 1848. But this is perhaps the earliest photographic image that we know of Trenton, of at least the Trenton area. So some of the other photographers who were in Trenton early on, how many people here have heard of Augustus Washington? I see one hand, 2 hands, 3 hands. Maybe. Augustus Washington was born in Trenton. He was an African American. He left Trenton and he ended up going to New England, and he ended up opening up a daguerreotype studio in Connecticut. And he was, not surprisingly, he was anti-slavery. And so he did this portrait of John Brown in the 1840s. We don't know that he made many daguerreotypes in Trenton, but he learned how to make daguerreotypes in Trenton. He returned to Trenton, where he was from, and then he went back to New England, and that's when he started doing daguerreotyping. He was at Dartmouth College as a student, and in order to help pay for his college expenses, he started doing daguerreotypes. After a while, he dropped out of college, and then he opened up a studio in Connecticut. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, Washington became very concerned that he might just be grabbed by slave stealers and taken south, and by that time he had a wife and children, and so he decided to emigrate to Liberia. And in Liberia, he had a very successful career. He photographed there. He did portraits of the Liberian legislators in daguerreotypes. He also had a plantation where he employed many people. And unfortunately, after about a dozen years, he caught a fever and he died. So he didn't live too long. So other photographers who, there were quite a few photographers in the 1840s, in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s in Trenton. So I'm not going to be able to talk about a lot of them, but I want to mention Morris Moses because he's connected to Stokes in a way. So he was from England, and he was active in Trenton from 1850 to 1873 as a photographer. He emigrated in 1833, and he had a brother and sister who were also photographers. I'm going to mention a little bit about the sister in a few minutes. And in 1860, in the census, he reported $4,500 net worth, which is about $100,000 today. So not a rich guy, but a middle-class fellow. He had 6 children by 1870, 5 of whom survived to 1900. He opened up his daguerreotype studio in City Hall in Trenton in 1850. Now that's a great location because all the people are coming for government purposes. It's the center of town, and Now it's called Old City Hall. The building is still there. And then he sells that studio to Stokes. So that's one of the connections between them. And then he moved to 13 East State to another place called Mansion House, where his studio burned, but he stayed in business. He recovered from the fire, and he stayed in business for another few years, and he went into the coal business. Here's a picture of the City Hall, which is a site of both the Morris and the Stokes studios. So Morris goes into the coal business, and then he's with his brother for a few years, and then he leaves the photography business and just sticks in the coal business. He was a member of the Odd Fellows, which I will mention again a little bit later. And he dies at the age of 58, leaving his widow, Ellen. And he's buried in Riverview Cemetery. His daughter married Charles Allen, who became the fire chief of Trenton. Here's some examples of Moses' work. I can find a lot more examples of Moses than I can of Stokes, in part because he was active as a photographer for a much longer period of time. Many of the daguerreotypists in this era did not put their name on their products. The name would occur, as you see here in the lower left, imprinted into the brass mat. So if you had a good business, you could afford to justify putting your name on there. Or you would have it in the case. The case is, one of those is a full case, the other is a half case. If you have a full case, the red velvet opposite the image, sometimes you'll see a name in there, in the design. But many daguerreotypes have no identification whatsoever as to who made them. Moses and Stokes are two examples of daguerreotypists who did identify their work, at least some of their work, because we have those examples. For me, it's really interesting to see people who lived here so long ago, more than 150 years ago. Many of these people are unidentified. We wonder what kind of lives they led. We can look at their expressions and try to imagine, what kind of a person they were, or what kind of person they grew up to be. Here's a copy daguerreotype. You can see that there's an image of the brass mat around the edges of the daguerreotype image. This woman was born in the 1700s. She was born around 1785, before the Constitution was formed. Imagine what she saw, during her life. She lived through the War of 1812 when Washington, D.C. was burned. All kinds of things. It's an unidentified man by Moses. A woman with some hand coloring on the daguerreotypes. Now, in the late 1850s, another process became popular. It was a cheap knockoff of the daguerreotype called an ambrotype. An ambrotype is an underexposed glass negative that looks positive when it has a dark backing. And that could be achieved either through putting a dark piece of felt or paper or metal behind the daguerreotype, behind the ambrotype plate, or they could use a dark glass, dark colored glass, like dark red glass. And those are called ruby ambrotypes. So because they were using glass to make the image, it was much less expensive than image made on copper. So between 1856 and 1860, ambrotypes become increasingly popular. And photographers would advertise as to what kind of pictures they made. They would say, or they would identify themselves in directories as daguerreotypist or ambrotypist or photographist, which referred to a photographer who made pictures on paper. Some photographers who became mature during this era continued using photographist for many years. This is one where you can see Moses' name in Trenton, New Jersey, in the plush on the left-hand side. Here's Governor Joel Parker, who was New Jersey's governor during the Civil War, photographed by Morris Moses. This is carte de visite. I had the original one. This was sent to me by a friend of mine in Michigan, who didn't know who it was, because she knew I collected New Jersey stuff. And I said, oh, I got it. And I said, thank you very much. And that's the governor of New Jersey. Of course, in the 1860s, during this new era of carte de visite photography, these are the small paper photographs. That's the Civil War time also. So you see Civil War soldiers and being photographed by Moses, as well as perhaps widows. Here's an example of an advertising photo on a carte de visite by Moses of a dentist in Hopewell, New Jersey. So this is another application of photography, was for advertising. This picture has you can see this young boy, and he's stabilizing himself by holding a book against the table. But if you look behind his feet, there's some kind of a strange object back there. That's the feet of the immobilizer. It's a stand that goes up behind his head and holds his head like a clam. Here's a Civil War soldier. This is from the New Jersey State Archives, Warren B. Fawcett. And this one's from the New Jersey State Museum. There's another one from the State Museum's collection. Now, Morris's sister, Maggie Moses, inherited her parents' house in 1861, and one of the witnesses to her mother's will was Stokes. So here's another connection between the Stokes and the Moses families. She married a widower, Lois Brown, who was a carpenter in 1874, and then she became a camera operator for the Adolph Beer studio in Trenton. Now, she probably was a photographer before this. Perhaps she was working for her brother in the Morris Moses studio. But in any event, in this late 1870s, she's working for Beer. Beer was had a very big business in Trenton. There's a lot of examples of his work. Beginning in the 1870s, you start to see more and more cabinet cards. This is the larger format card photo that's about 4 by 6 inches, whereas the carte de visite is about 2 by 4 inches. This is from the Beer studio during that period, John Roebling's grandchildren. This is at the New Jersey State Museum. And here's another one from the Beer studio during the time when Maggie Moses was the photographer there. So we don't know for sure that she took these pictures, but it's very likely that she did. And I could imagine, especially with children, that a woman photographer would have been an advantage, to take these photos. Okay, now after that intro, we're ready to talk about Edward Stokes. He was born in in Morristown, and he was the fourth son of Samuel and Marion Conroe Stokes. And he moved to Trenton in 1840. Now, there are a lot of people with very similar names. So if you ever get involved in researching Stokes, you have to be aware that there are a lot of other people with names E.H. Stokes. And sometimes they're the right guy, and sometimes they're the wrong guys. So some of the other Edward H. Stokes include the father of New Jersey Governor Edward C. Stokes in 1905, and that guy was from Millville. E.H. Stokes, who lived in Northern Liberties in Philadelphia, who was a real estate investor. He had a lot of real estate. $60,000 is a lot of money in 1850. prominent slave dealer in Richmond, Virginia, named E.H. Stokes. It's definitely not our guy. And then there's the Reverend Elwood H. Stokes, sometimes referred to as E.H. Stokes, who's the founder of Ocean Grove. There was, in the 1860 census, there's two E.H. Stokes who are labeled, who are connected to photography. There's one that's E.H. Stokes with hardly any money. He's listed in the census in 1860. I have no idea who this guy is. And then there's Edward Stiles Stokes and Edward S. Stokes, who was the owner of an New York oil refinery, who's famous for shooting Diamond Jim Fisk in a lover's quarrel in 1872. So our guy, he was born in Morristown. He lived from 1824 to 1900. And he moves to Trenton and lived with his married brother Samuel, who was a shoemaker. And there's at least one other shoemaker in the family. So there's a hunch I have that back in Morristown, there was a business of shoemaking going on in the family, and then some of them moved to Trenton. In 1850, he's listed without an occupation in the 1850 census. That's unfortunate, but it's right before he gets involved in photography. And he's first listed as a daguerreotypist in 1852. So from 1852 to 1860, those are his years in photography. In addition to photography, he was also the agent for the then new Singer sewing machines. And at the Trentoniana collection of the Trenton Free Public Library, they have a document that says, this is to certify that I appoint and constitute E.H. Stokes as my lawful and only agent in and for the county of Mercer for selling the Singer sewing machine. So this is right before he opens the daguerreotype studio, 1851. So he's involved in another business. How extensive, I don't know, but this is what that machine looked like back then. It looks kind of to me like a bandsaw more than a sewing machine. But in any event, that was the Singer sewing machine that became so popular, really revolutionized the industry of making clothing. So here in October of 1852, Edward Stokes starts advertising his Daguerrean gallery. And he says that it's at 37 East State Street, and the entrance is through Runk and Owen's clothing store. So you had to go through the clothing store in order to get to the daguerreotype studio. And this is what it looks like recently. The Wild Horse menswear. I took this picture about 3 years ago. I have no idea whether this is still the case. I don't know if anybody here.
The building's still there, I think.
Oh yeah, the building's there. I don't know if it's still the same store though.
No.
But it was still clothing there. And then this is an interesting ad. In 1853, there's some price fixing going on among the daguerreotypists in Trenton. Morris Moses, Jonathan F. Cheeseman, and Stokes say that they're going to make daguerreotypes for 50 cents, all three of them. So they're not going to compete with each other. They're all going to have the same price, presumably for a certain size. That would be a small size. And they give the addresses of the three there. Here's another ad by Stokes in which he says that he can add color to the pictures, and that would be, hand-applied color. We can talk about that later if you want to get into more details. But for the most part, daguerreotypes came out in black and white. So there were some ways of introducing a little bit of blue, depending on how you expose them. But mostly, if you wanted color, you had to add it, and of course, you would pay a little bit more to have that done. Though some daguerreotypists did that themselves. Others who had bigger studios, they would hire an artist who that would be all they would do. So this is one that I brought with me. You can see this unidentified young fellow looking right into the camera. This is by Stokes. Here's one that's at Harvard University. They're a little hard to find. More of them may turn up. Anybody here have one? You have one?
Yeah, I collect them.
Did you bring it with you?
I should have.
Oh. Well, if you could send me a scan, I could add it to the next time I talk about this guy. Here's another one. This one has his imprint underneath the image. And this is another one that I brought of the woman. So that's it. That's all the daguerreotypes I know about that I've been able to find by Stokes. So as I mentioned earlier, he takes off over Morris Moses' studio in 1858, and then in 1860 he marries Permelia Wood. Now, you may know that Joseph Wood had been the mayor of Trenton. He was a very wealthy guy, and he had just died right before Stokes marries Permelia. And guess where Mr. Wood lived? Here. So Stokes moves into Woodlawn. That was the name of the house at that time. And later on it became known as the Trent House. Here's the Trent House. So here's a marriage notice in Trenton on the 21st instant by Reverend White, Edward H. Stokes, to Miss Permelia S., daughter of the late Joseph S. Wood, Esquire, of all of that city. This is from newspaper June 26, 1860. And here we look at the very interesting census return for 1860, taken on July 15th, which shows Edward H. Stokes, 37, artist, which often daguerreotypists listed themselves as artists in the census. He has real estate valued at $1,200, and he has a personal estate valued at $8,000, which totals up to the equivalent of about $350,000, which is a upper middle class guy for sure for that time period. However, Permelia, having inherited her father's wealth, had a net worth equivalent today of $26 million. So guess what Stokes does? He retires. There's also Miriam Stokes living with them, who's 73 years old, who might be an aunt of Edward H. Stokes. It's not the name of his mother, but it could be an aunt. And then there is a housekeeper, Priscilla, Lydia, a cook, and Catherine, a domestic. Catherine is from Württemberg, what is now Germany. So this would be something that you would be researching, right? Who these other folks were. Now, in 1907, in this book, Genealogical and Personal Memorial of Mercer County, it states, for several years, Stokes was a leading photographer, and being a man of rare judgment, foresaw the rise of real estate and invested largely therein, thereby realizing an ample fortune. No, that's not true. He got the ample fortune by marrying Permelia. He had a little bit of real estate, but nothing like what he got, later. So he becomes an investor after his marriage. And in 1861, his father-in-law's estate conveys Woodlawn to him. So he didn't get it from his wife, he got it directly from the estate. And he and Permelia together had 6 children, of whom 2 died young. Stokes became active in the community. He was president of the Trenton School Board from 1868 to 1874. And in 1870, his son Joseph died at the age of 9 of scarlet fever. I'll come back to that because that required a change in his will. And from 1876 to around 1879, he was director of the Standard Fire Insurance Company. Now, I want to turn to St. Francis Hospital, which was started by nuns here in Trenton. It was dedicated in 1874, and the major benefactors that built that hospital were Stokes, John Curran, Samuel Wilson, and the Roebling family. So this is an example of one of his philanthropic activities. And so I really think of him today as first a daguerreotypist primarily, but then as a philanthropist towards the end of his life. He was a member of the Board of Health in 1877. He chaired a citizens group to obtain better railroad service. And then he owned something called the Jenny Lind Hotel, and he demolished it and built brick houses on the site. I don't know exactly where that was, but there's an article in 1880 newspaper, Trenton Gazette, which said that this hotel was an old landmark and associated with George Washington, I guess, who ordered punch, when he visited it, at some point in the past. And the article is kind of ruining the destruction of this historic hotel, the Jenny Lind. But I guess that was something that Stokes thought would benefit him. Here's the 1880 census, and for some reason, he's listed here as a tailor. Now, I have no idea why that happened. They also got wrong Permelia's name. They wrote her down as Camelia instead of Permelia. Maybe he had a clothing store somewhere, and that's why they put him down as a tailor. And then there's a daughter, Marianne, son Edward, son John, another daughter, Alice. Then there's a gardener, a governess, 2 more servants, and a seamstress. So there's a lot of people living here. He was offered the school superintendent nomination, and he declined it in 1881. He was considered for mayor by the Democrats, didn't get that. He was the Trenton Water Commissioner from 1881 to 1883. He was a member of a temperance reform organization in 1882. And he was a member of the Board of Trustees for the State Industrial Home for Girls for 16 years. The exact dates were not mentioned in his obituary, just that he'd been there for 16 years. Now, he was definitely associated with this Union Industrial Home Association for Destitute Children. In 1885, he and his wife purchased a lot on Chestnut Avenue and gave it for the home. The building was dedicated in 1888, and he became a member of the advisory board. He was also active in the New Jersey Historical Society. For several years, he served on the nominating committee for the officers. He also was appointed a member of the Standing Committee for Statistics in the 1890s. Another example of his philanthropy is that he apparently gave a substantial donation to the city of Charleston, South Carolina, for aid to earthquake victims. And at the Trentoniana collection, there's this copy of a letter of appreciation addressed to E.H. Stokes, Trenton. I guess you didn't need a street address for him. Has a nice period stamp on it too, from the 1880s. So suddenly he dies in February of 1900. Here's a copy of his signature. Very nice signature. Flows beautifully from left to right. Now, there were quite a few nice obituaries about him. The Asbury Park Press said he was one of the wealthiest citizens of Trenton, known for his charitable works. The Asbury Park Journal said he was one of the oldest Oddfellows in the state, having joined 50 years ago. It would have been 1850 when he first came to Trenton. He has a nice monument in Riverview Cemetery. And after his death, his wife Permelia donated a portrait painting to St. Francis Hospital. And the painting was made by a celebrated Philadelphia artist whose name is not provided. And then it was given to the hospital, and at the bottom there it says, "The sisters greatly appreciate this gift coming from the widow and son of their deceased benefactor, and it will ever occupy a position of honor." So I called over there and asked, can I see this painting? I want to make a picture of it, and they could not find it. So it may still exist. It's supposed to have a card on it identifying Stokes, but they could not locate it. Now I'll turn to his will. In his will of February of 1870, he left the house to his wife, and on her death to his son, Joseph Henry Stokes. But as I mentioned earlier, Joseph dies later that year. So that created a problem. So he added a codicil to his will in 1881. And in the codicil, he says that he's going to leave the mansion to his wife, and upon her death, it should go to the Union Industrial Home Association for Destitute Children of Trenton, New Jersey. Well, that did not happen. So what did happen? In 1901, his other son, who survived him, Edward A. Stokes, acquired the Trent House, what became the Trent House, in a sheriff's sale. Now, how did that go? I do not fully understand how that happened. There was something to do with a mortgage, and that there was 2 mortgages. Stokes filed a motion to foreclose the 2 mortgages, then there was a decree, and they decided to have a sheriff's sale, and Edward A. Stokes ends up obtaining the mansion. So it never went to the industrial home. And then Edward A. Stokes, of course, donates the house to Trenton after he no longer wants to live here in 1929. Now I want to close with a little bit about Stockton Stokes, who was his nephew. Stockton Stokes grew up in Willingboro, and his father was a shoemaker. There's another shoemaker in the family. He marries a Sarah Ward in 1863, and he opens up a photography studio at 30 East State Street in 1864. He becomes partners with another photographer named Jonathan Good for a couple of years towards the end of the Civil War. And here's a stereographic view taken by Good before they were partners. And down the street you can see a little sign that says photograph rooms, and that's where Stockton Stokes had his studio. They then become partners, and one of their products was this picture of Abraham Lincoln by an unknown photographer, and they were selling these knockoffs in the post-Civil War period. Here he's hiring William Curtis Taylor, a Philadelphia photographer, to help him with his business. And in 1867, we have his income tax returns. They're available online from the Ancestry.com has them. In the first half of 1867, his income was among the highest among Trenton photographers. He also was involved with his younger brother Edmund towards the late 1860s. And in 1870, he's living with relatives in Trenton, and his wife isn't on the picture anymore, so we don't know what happened to her. And then he moves to Philadelphia, and he's a photographer there until 1889. So in the 1860s, he is in Trenton, and he's making photographs, which you see quite a few examples of. In 1883, he was injured in a train wreck in Pleasantville, probably Pleasantville, New Jersey. And in 1890, he pleaded guilty for sending threatening and scurrilous letters and postcards through the mail. Why or what they were about, I have no idea. So I'll just show you, these are some carte de visites by Stockton Stokes. can see a certain style here. Hold on to the chair and look at the camera. Here's some with some nice hand coloring. Here's an outdoor carte de visite of a firehouse, and you can see on the left, you can see the shadow of Stokes with the camera on a tripod. It's very cool. Here's a guy leaning who looks like he might be a little inebriated. And there are Civil War soldiers also. There's another one with some hand coloring. There's a couple.
Are these daguerreotypes or not?
These are carte de visites. They're paper on cardboard. Yeah, the paper is albumin paper, which is egg white, paper coated with egg white, and then it's floated on a bath of silver nitrate to make it light sensitive. Then it's hung up to dry, and you can use it within a few days. And then finally this one, this is a cabinet card from his Philadelphia studio, and it's unidentified, but it looks to me a lot like Stokes. And the picture we have of Stokes is later, and this looks like a younger version of him. And it would make sense that his uncle would come to Philadelphia at some point and stop by to see his nephew and maybe have his picture made. But he also looks like the last Reconstruction governor of South Carolina, Daniel Chamberlain. And then when the I was going to say when the Ku Klux Klan took over South Carolina again, but the anti-North group takes over South Carolina. He has to leave, and he ends up going back north where he'd come from. And so it could be Chamberlain, and it could be Stokes. They both look kind of similar. I kind of like to think it was Stokes, but in any event, that's the end. And we did it.